The arrow hit the ferry post 3 inches from Abraham Talbot's ear, and the woman who fired it was already knocking a second shaft before he could draw breath. He did not run. He had learned long ago that running from something faster than you only gave it a better angle. So he stood on the muddy bank of the Greyvale crossing with river water soaking his boots and his hands raised, and he looked at the archer standing on the opposite bank like she was deciding whether he was worth the second arrow. She was the largest woman he had ever seen. Not in the way of the big-boned farm wives of Greyvale who swung scythes and carried milk pails without complaint, but in the way of something built specifically to be dangerous. She stood well over 6 feet, green-skinned and broad-shouldered, with a jaw that carried 2 short tusks the color of old ivory. Her dark hair was pulled back and bound with cord, though several thick strands had escaped and hung across her face in the wind off the river. She wore a fitted bodice of dark leather, molded close to her form and laced tight up the front with crossed cord, over a pair of sturdy traveling trousers tucked into knee-high boots. Bandoliers crossed her chest, hung with small pouches and a short-bladed knife. A quiver rode her back, and the longbow in her hands was a beautiful, terrifying thing, carved from some pale wood and strung with what looked like braided sinew. She was looking at him with yellow eyes that did not blink. "I am the gamekeeper," Abraham said, which was both true and perhaps not the most useful thing he could have said in that moment. "For Lord Harwick's estate. This is his river crossing." "I know whose river it is," she said. Her voice was deeper than he expected and precise. She spoke the common tongue without an accent which surprised him. Most orcs he had encountered in his 31 years spoke the trade pidgin, not the full language. "I used it before Harwick put a gate on it." Abraham lowered his hand slightly, not all the way down, just enough to seem less like a man preparing to die. "When were you last through here?" The arrow did not lower. 7 years ago. He knew then who she was. There was only one name that came attached to that number. 7 years ago the old Lord Harwick, father of the current one, had granted passage rights to a small band of Greyvale orcs who served as hired blades during the Thornwood disputes. They had been led by a woman the mill workers called the Rageborn, because she had killed 3 mounted soldiers without a weapon when they cornered her in the mill yard and tried to take her contract money without paying. She had beaten them half to death with a broken cartwheel spoke. He had been 24 years old and working the forest edges as a junior gamekeeper's hand when that happened. He had not seen it, but he had heard the story approximately 300 times since then. "Murak," he said. The bow came down exactly 1 inch. "You know my name," she said. "Everybody in the valley knows your name." He took 1 careful step forward, mud sucking at his boot. "The question is whether you know mine." She studied him. He watched her eyes move over him the way a hunter reads terrain, cataloging, comparing, deciding. He was not a remarkable man to look at. Average height for a human male, lean from years of walking the forest ridges, with dark brown hair going to gray at the temples and a face that had spent too long in the weather to be called handsome in any conventional sense. He had good hands, people told him, strong and careful. He could track a wounded deer 3 miles through wet bracken and set a broken limb straight, and those things showed more in the quality of his stillness than in anything about his appearance. "Talbot," she said finally, "Abraham Talbot, you took over the gamekeeping when old Pell died." 2 years ago, he confirmed. "You have been paying attention." "I pay attention to who controls the land I might need to cross." She lowered the bow fully, though she did not unstring it or put it away. "The old crossing agreement Harwick's father made, does it still stand?" Abraham looked out across the river. The ferry was a flat-bottomed barge on a guide rope, tied to the near bank. Harwick the younger had ordered the gate and the fee 3 years back, but the agreement his father had made with the Greyvale orcs was not something that had ever been formally revoked in writing. Abraham knew this because he had read every agreement in the estate ledger when he took the position. He was thorough by nature. "Technically," he said, "it stands. The young lord has not dissolved it in writing. He has only added a gate and a fee, which is arguably a breach of the original terms rather than a supersession of them." She stared at him across the water. "Are you a gamekeeper or a lawyer?" I read a great deal, he said. It is a quiet job most of the year. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, something more guarded than that but adjacent to it. She began walking down to the water's edge on her side. He walked down to the barge on his. The crossing took 7 minutes. She stood on the flat barge and watched the far bank approach, and he worked the rope hand over hand, and neither of them spoke. But he was aware of her the entire time in a way that was not entirely professional. The wind off the river pressed her hair back from her face, and he could see the line of her jaw, the way the tendons in her neck moved when she watched the water, the easy way she balanced on the moving barge without holding anything. A warrior's balance. A body that knew where it was at all times. When they reached the near bank, she stepped off before the barge had fully settled, landing in the shallows without hesitation and walking up onto firm ground. She stood there while he tied the barge off, and she watched the road that led up through the riverside willows toward the Greyvale mills. "How is the mood in town?" she asked. "Toward orcs generally. Poor." He finished the knot and stood up. "Harwick the Younger has been stirring sentiment since the Thornwood disputes ended. He lost the contracts he thought he would get, and he has been looking for something to blame. The Greenville orcs who took jobs in Thornwood are the current answer. That is what I expected." She turned and looked at him directly. "I came through alone. I am going to the Greenville settlement in the Fenhallow Hills. I need 2 days' travel through the valley." "That is 2 days of Harwick's land," Abraham said. "Yes." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The morning light was at a low angle, and it caught the green of her skin in a way that was almost amber at the edges, and her yellow eyes were steady and clear, and they held in them an expression that was not quite asking and not quite demanding. It was the expression of someone who had learned to state needs plainly and let others decide, because showing need directly had never once made anyone give her anything. He recognized that expression. He had worn it himself more times than he could count. "The gamekeeper's cottage is on the south ridge," he said. "It sits back from the main road, but the track through the estate forest is faster than the valley road. I patrol it every day. If anyone questions your presence, you can say you are with me." A long silence. The river ran past them. "Why?" she asked. "Because the agreement stands," he said, "and because it is the right thing to do." She did not say thank you. She said, "You might lose your position for it." "I might," he agreed. "Lord Harwick and I have been disagreeing about the management of this estate for some time now. One more disagreement will not matter much either way." He turned and started up the bank toward the tree line. After 3 seconds, he heard her footsteps behind him, steady and quiet on the mud, hardly any sound at all for a person her size, and he thought, Of course she walks like that." He did not say it aloud. He just walked, and she followed, and the willows closed around them. The gamekeeper's cottage sat on a shelf of land above the river valley, surrounded by a stand of old oak that Abraham had been tending for most of his 2 years in the position. The stone walls were thick, and the roof was new patched. He had a small stable for his horse, a garden that was doing better than it had any right to, and a workshop where he kept his tools, snares, mending supplies, the ledgers, a good longbow of his own that saw less use than the ledgers did. He had inherited the cottage from old Pell along with the job, and he had made it his own slowly, the way a man does when he has no one to rush him into anything. He made tea on the hearth and put out bread and hard cheese without asking whether she wanted it. She sat at the table. The chair groaned under her, but held and ate and drank without comment, and he did not make conversation because she did not seem to want it, and he had never been the kind of man who filled silence with noise for its own sake. But he watched her when she was not watching him. She ate with her hands, and her attention was always elsewhere, at the window, at the door, at the shadows in the room, and he understood that this was not rudeness. This was the habit of a person who had been in enough dangerous situations that the body simply never stopped scanning. He had a little of that himself, from his years walking the forest, though nothing like what she carried. "You were in the Thornwood disputes," he said. "Yes." "Which side?" The side that paid, she said without embarrassment. We are mercenaries. We do not have the luxury of sides. The Greenville band was always straight in their dealings. No one in the valley had complaints that I heard. She looked at him across the table. That surprised you? No, he said. It confirmed what I thought. The reputation you have here, the story people tell about the mill yard, most people tell it like a monster story. I always thought it sounded more like a story about someone who was owed something and collected it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 3 men tried to take my contract payment and put their hands on me in the process. I did what needed doing. Yes, he said simply. She looked at him again and something shifted in her face that was not the adjacent to a smile thing from the river. It was something more direct than that, something assessing but differently than before. Before, she had been reading him for threat. Now she was reading him for something else, and he did not look away from it. How long have you been here alone? She asked. He blinked. Of all the questions he had expected, that was not among them. 2 years in this cottage. Before that, 6 years working under Pell all across the estate. He paused. I have not been in a town with any regularity since I was about 25. Then you are less shaped by what the town thinks, she said, as if this were a logical conclusion rather than a personal observation. Less shaped, he agreed. Not entirely free of it. He looked at her steadily. I notice what you look like, Murak. I am not pretending otherwise. But I am also old enough and quiet enough to know that noticing a thing and being ruled by it are different matters. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she finished her tea. In the afternoon, he took her through the estate forest on the patrol track. He showed her the route she would need to follow the next morning, the path that curved around the mill workers' quarters and came out at the south edge of the valley, where the Fenhallow Road began. He pointed out the 2 spots where Harwick's other workers regularly passed, and the one barn where the overseer sometimes slept off his midday drink. She listened without writing anything down, and he knew she was memorizing it perfectly. They walked in silence mostly, but it was an easy silence. The forest was in full mid-spring leaf, and the light came through in long gold columns, and she moved through it without disturbing anything, which Abraham found deeply satisfying in a way he would have been hard-pressed to articulate. He had spent years watching people crash through the forest like they were fighting it. She moved like something that belonged to it. You track, she said at one point, watching him examine a set of deer prints. Yes. How far can you follow a cold trail? Depends on the substrate. In leaf litter 4 days, maybe 5 if there was no rain. Mud longer. Snow almost indefinitely if the drift patterns cooperated. He stood and looked in the direction the deer had gone. I do not usually pursue them that long. Pell's rule was always, know where they are, not just where they went. That is a good rule, she said. He was a good man, Abraham said. That evening, when the light was low and the valley below was going gold and then gray, they sat outside the cottage on the stone bench Abraham had built against the south wall, and the air smelled of river and new leaves and the distant smoke of the mill fires, and she told him without preamble that she had been through the valley 7 years ago and she had not forgotten it. He turned to look at her. I remember you, she said. You were the gamekeeper's hand. You were at the mill crossing when the overseer tried to charge us tolls we had not agreed to. You were the one who went back to the estate house and came out with the written agreement from the old lord and read it to the overseer in front of everyone. Abraham said nothing for a moment. He did remember that. He had been 24 and furious on behalf of a group of people he barely knew, and he had walked the 2 miles to the estate house and back in under an hour, and read the document out in a voice loud enough to carry across the mill yard. I did not know you saw that, he said. I was 22, and I had never seen a human do that, she said. For us. Without being asked. It was the right thing, he said. People say that, fewer people do it. The silence that followed was a different kind, heavier with what it held. I thought about you, she said. After we left, occasionally, he said, I thought about you too. She looked at him directly, and he met her eyes, and the 7 years between them collapsed into a very small space that contained a very large amount of what had not been said or done at 24 and 22. And he was suddenly and acutely aware that he was sitting approximately 2 feet from a woman who was looking at him like he was something she had found that she had not expected to still be here. She did not move toward him, but something in the air changed. He said carefully, "You have a 2-day journey tomorrow." "I do," she agreed. "You should stay the night here. The guest room is a storage room presently, but the floor is level and I have a good bedroll." She looked at him for a moment that stretched slightly longer than necessary. "Are you certain?" "Murak," he said. "You have been walking since before dawn and you have another full day of walking tomorrow. Stay." She stayed. That night he could hear her moving in the storage room, not restlessly, just the small sounds of a person settling, adjusting, checking her weapons as she laid them down. He lay in his own bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the way she had said, "I thought about you," occasionally, in that precise, deliberate voice that clearly rationed every word for weight and meaning, and he understood that in her vocabulary, occasionally might mean quite a lot. He did not sleep for some time. In the morning she was up before he was. He found her in the yard splitting his firewood without having been asked, and she was very good at it. The axe came down with an efficiency that was almost meditative. The log fell in exactly 2 pieces every time. She had stacked a week's worth by the time he came out with tea. He handed her a mug without comment. She took it without comment. They drank tea in the yard and watched the morning come up over the ridge, and it felt remarkably natural. "I should go," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She handed back the mug. She picked up her pack and her bow and her quiver and went to the yard gate, and at the gate she stopped. "The Valley Road," she said without turning around. "What are they saying about the Greyvale orcs specifically? Names mentioned." "Yours," Abraham said. "Harwick the Younger has specifically named you. Someone told him you were moving through the valley." She turned at that. "Who?" "I do not know. I only know because I heard it at the estate market 3 days ago from one of the house servants." He held her gaze. "He has sent riders to the Greyvale ford and the Millbridge crossing. He does not know about this one." Her jaw set. "He wants to take me in. On what pretext I cannot tell you. Harwick does not always need a pretext that holds up to examination." Abraham set down his mug. "Take the south track, not the main forest path. At the Standing Oak you go east along the Briar Ridge instead of following the water. It adds half an hour, but it keeps you well clear of the mill road for the first 5 miles. She stared at him. "You thought about this morning?" "I thought about it most of last night," he said honestly. That stretched between them for a moment. "Abraham Talbot," she said, and the way she said it was like she was testing the weight of it. "If Harwick finds out you helped me, I know. You could lose more than your position. I know that too." She was very still for a moment, and he could see something behind her eyes that was not wariness this time and not the assessing look from before. It was something rower than that. Something that looked like it was deciding whether it could afford to exist. "East at the Standing Oak," she said. "East," he confirmed. "And Murak, come back through the same way when you are done in Fenhallow if you need to. The crossing will be open." She looked at him for one more moment that held a great deal. Then she went through the gate and up the south track, and the forest took her, and she made no more sound than the wind in the oaks did. He stood in the yard for some time after she was gone. 3 weeks passed. Abraham went about his work, the patrol rounds, the ledger entries, the slow, satisfying labor of maintaining a forest that was older than the estate that claimed it. He repaired a fence along the north boundary. He negotiated with a poacher who turned out to be a starving miller's hand, and let the man go with a warning and a half-loaf of bread, which was the kind of thing that made him useless as a gamekeeper by Lord Harwick's standards and perfectly suited to his own. He thought about Murak Rageborn approximately as often as he had thought about her in the 7 years before, except now the thoughts were not hazy and half-formed, but sharp and specific. The angle of her jaw in the morning light, the precise way she said his name. On the 23rd day she came back. He heard her on the south track before he saw her, not because she made any sound but because his horse did. The mare picked her head up and looked south with her ears sharp, and Abraham turned from the fence post he was mending and stood, and Murak came out of the tree line with her longbow in her hand and her face wearing an expression he had not seen on her before. Anger. Sharp, barely contained. He waited. "Harwick's men are in the Fenhalo approach," she said, stopping 5 feet from him. 6 of them, armed. They have a writ. I do not know what it says, but the headman of the Greyvale settlement told me they served it 2 days before I arrived, and it named me specifically. "What kind of writ?" Abraham asked, moving toward her. The headman called it an expulsion order. "Harwick claims the Greyvale orcs are sheltering a criminal mercenary, and the settlement's land use agreement with the Valley Council is forfeit unless they surrender her." She said criminal mercenary without any particular emotion, in the tone of someone reading a ridiculous thing aloud. Abraham stopped 3 feet from her. "He is using the settlement as leverage." "Yes." "Can he do that legally?" "The headman does not know. Neither do I." Her jaw was tight. "I will not be the reason that settlement loses its land. They have been there 40 years. Old people, families." She stopped on the word families as if it were a stone she had stubbed her foot on. "Then you cannot go back to them," Abraham said. "I know. And you cannot go anywhere else in the valley without running into his riders." "I know," she said again. He looked at her. She looked back at him with those clear yellow eyes that were holding a great deal more than they were showing, and he felt the specific weight of that, the weight of someone who had always figured things out alone, standing in front of the one person in a long time who might actually be useful. "You could stay here," he said. The words were simple. He had been thinking about them for 23 days. She was quiet. The mare blew out a breath through her nose in the stable. "That is dangerous for you," Murak said. "Probably," he agreed. "Harwick will eventually extend his search to the gamekeeper's forest." "He will," Abraham said. "But he has to get past the gamekeeping ledgers first, and I write very thorough and boring ledgers. It buys time." She searched his face. He let her look. "Time for what?" she asked. "Time to figure out how to dissolve a writ that was issued on insufficient grounds, and return the Greyvale settlement's land use agreement to its proper standing," he said. "And perhaps in the process make Lord Harwick's pattern of unlawful overreach into the official record of the Valley Council, where it might do some lasting damage to his ability to continue doing this kind of thing." She stared at him. "You are a gamekeeper," she said very slowly. "I am a gamekeeper," he confirmed. "Who has spent 2 years reading every ledger and agreement and legal instrument on this estate, and who knows people in Greyvale who are not friends of Lord Harwick, and who have been waiting for exactly this kind of documented evidence." A long silence, a very long one. "Abraham Talbot," she said, in that weight-testing way she had. "Murak Rageborn," he said. And something crossed her face that was finally, genuinely, a smile. It transformed her not into something softer, but into something more fully itself, and it hit him square in the chest. "All right," she said. "I will stay." She stayed, and the days that followed were among the most alive Abraham Talbot could remember feeling in a very long time. She was not an easy person to live alongside. She woke before dawn and was outside by the time the light came, and she used the pre-dawn hours to run the forest ridges in a training circuit she had clearly been doing for years. She came back covered in sweat and sharpened by it, and she ate enough breakfast for 2 people, and then helped with whatever needed doing in a way that was entirely practical and never asked for thanks. She repaired things he had not gotten to: the stable roof, the gate hinge, the storage room shelves that had been sagging since he moved in, with a competence that made it clear she had spent time around homesteads and was not above the work. But she was also private in ways that he respected without pushing. She kept her weapons in the storage room and cleaned them each evening with a focused attention that was almost meditative. She did not speak much about the Greyvale settlement or the mercenary years or what 7 years of that life looked like. He did not ask. He was not a man who thought other people owed him their stories before they were ready to tell them. What she did talk about increasingly was everything else: the forest, the river, The valley politics she had been watching from outside, the nature of contracts and honor and what it meant to keep your word in a world that regularly broke its own. She talked about these things in the evenings when they sat outside after dinner, and he found that she had one of the finest minds he had encountered, rigorous and unsentimental and precise, with occasional flashes of dry humor that surprised him every time. He told her about Pell, about the 6 years of learning, the forest from a man who had known every tree in it by name, about the specific quality of silence in an old oak forest on a still morning. She listened the way she did most things, completely, without fidgeting, without waiting for her turn to speak. And the attraction between them, which had been present from the ferry crossing, did not diminish with proximity. It organized itself differently. It became specific. He knew the sound of her step on the stone floor. He knew the way she looked at the horizon when she was thinking hard about something. He knew, without her saying it, when a day had been difficult for her, a particular stillness came over her, a slight tension at the line of her jaw, and on those evenings he made sure the tea was ready and the fire was good, and he did not press for conversation. On the 8th night she caught him watching her, and she did not look away. "You do that often," she said. "Watch me." "Yes," he said. He had long since given up pretending otherwise. "Why?" He thought about how to say it. "Because you are remarkable," he said, "and I spent 7 years not getting to, and now you are here and I find I am making up for lost time." She looked at him for a long moment in the firelight. Then she said, "I watch you too, when you are not looking." "I know," he said. "Is that presumptuous for an orc woman to watch a human man?" "No," he said. "Is it presumptuous for me to watch you?" "No," she said. They looked at each other across the small space of the cottage interior, and the fire moved between them, and it was one of those moments where the next thing said or done would change the shape of everything. Abraham felt it with great clarity. He stood up and crossed the room and sat down beside her on the bench where she was cleaning her short blade, and she watched him do it with those steady yellow eyes, and when he was seated he reached out and very carefully tucked the loose strand of dark hair back from her face, and his fingertips just barely grazed her jaw. She went very still. "Abraham," she said. A warning or a question, he could not tell. "I know what I am doing," he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took his hand, the one that had touched her jaw, and she held it in both of hers, and her hands were enormous and warm and calloused and entirely steady. "This is not simple," she said. "No," he agreed. "I have never had much interest in simple." Something in her eyes changed, opened in a way he had not seen before, and she leaned forward and kissed him, which was not something he had expected her to initiate, and it was firm and deliberate and entirely her, no hesitation, no coyness, just a decision made and followed through with complete commitment, and it lasted long enough to be unmistakably a declaration. When she pulled back, her eyes were dark, and her expression was something he did not have a word for but would spend the next weeks trying to describe to himself. "I have wanted to do that since the ferry," she said. "Then I wish you had," he said. She laughed, which was a sound he had not heard from her before, low and real and startled out of her, and she kept hold of his hand, and they sat by the fire for a long time after that, not rushing anything, because there was suddenly no need to rush. The shape of things had changed. They both knew it. Over the next week they worked on the problem of Harwick's writ in the mornings and spent the evenings as people who had chosen each other without quite having made any formal announcement of it. He pulled the original Greyvale land use agreement from the estate ledger. He had a copy, because he made copies of everything, and compared it against the current Valley Council statutes. The agreement had been registered with the council, not just with the estate. Harwick could not unilaterally void it without council process, which meant the expulsion writ was issued under false authority. He wrote this up carefully in his best hand on 3 pages. He sent it by messenger to a woman named Vera Ashton in Greyvale, who ran the Mill Workers' Guild, and who had, on 3 separate occasions in the last 2 years, expressed a desire to see Lord Harwick's overreach documented in a way that could not be dismissed. Vera Ashton wrote back in 4 days. The message was 2 sentences. I have the valley magistrate ready to hear this. Bring your witness. Abraham showed the letter to Murak. The valley magistrate is not in Harwick's pocket, she asked. Magistrate Dauenfell is in nobody's pocket, Abraham said. He is 73 years old and deeply annoyed by people who misuse legal instruments, and he has been waiting for an actionable case against Harwick since the man started misusing them. He paused. The complication is that you would need to appear in Greyvale, in person. She absorbed this. In town, where Harwick's men are. Yes. And where the mood toward orcs is poor, as you said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, if it protects the settlement, I will do it. He looked at her steadily. I will be with you. Every step. She looked at him, that long, reading look she had, the one he was learning to sit inside comfortably rather than nervously, and she nodded once. They went to Greyvale on market day, which was Abraham's thinking, because market day meant the ferry was busy and the ferry master's attention was divided, and the crowd was large enough to absorb a newcomer before anyone had time to organize a reaction. It also meant Vera Ashton would have a reason to be in the market square without drawing attention, and Magistrate Fell could be present without it looking like a tribunal. What Abraham had not fully accounted for was Lord Harwick himself. They were 50 yards from the market square when they heard the commotion. A crowd had gathered at the old granary steps, 40, perhaps 50 people, the thick press of a market day audience with the specific quality of attention that meant someone was performing for them. And on the steps stood Lord Harwick the younger, who was 28 years old and well-dressed, and had the face of a man who had never once been told no in a language he understood. With him were 4 armed retainers. And beside Harwick, looking profoundly uncomfortable, was the ferry master, who had clearly been persuaded to say something about what he had seen at the crossing. Harwick was speaking to the crowd in the carrying voice of a man who has never doubted that he deserves to be heard. He was saying that the Greenville orc criminal had been sheltered, aided, and abetted by elements in the valley who were failing in their duty to the lawful order. He did not say Abraham's name, but his eyes, when he saw them come around the corner, landed on Abraham with an expression that contained very little surprise. He had known or guessed, and he had planned this. The crowd turned. 50 people in the morning light, a mix of mill workers and farmers and market vendors and their families, looking at the large orc woman standing beside the gamekeeper on the Greyvale Market Street. The silence had a specific quality, that held-breath quality of a crowd waiting to decide what it felt. Harwick came down 2 steps and raised his voice further. That is her. The mercenary Rageborn, wanted under the authority of the Valley Writ, under whose authority? Said a sharp voice from across the square. Vera Ashton was small and narrow and white-haired, and she crossed the market square like a blade, her voice carrying without effort. The authority of Lord Harwick, who registered that writ with the council without the council's consent, on grounds that do not exist in the council's statutes. That authority. A murmur went through the crowd. Harwick's face tightened. This is not the venue. The magistrate is right here, Vera said, and she gestured to the door of the Mill Guild Hall, from which Magistrate Dauenfell was emerging with his robe still being settled on his shoulders, and his expression that of a man who has been waiting for this for quite some time. For a moment the scene froze. Then Harwick made his mistake. He looked at Murak with the specific contempt of a man who has never had to consider what is standing in front of him, and he said, loud enough for all 50 people in the square to hear, "Take her." His 4 retainers started forward. Murak moved. She moved in a way that made the space change. One moment she was standing beside Abraham. The next she was forward between him and the retainers, and she was not attacking, she was stopping. The first retainer grabbed her arm, and she simply redirected the force of it, pivoting her body in a way that sent him into the second retainer with a force that put both of them on the ground. The third swung a fist, and she caught his wrist in one hand and just held it, and looked him in the face with those clear yellow eyes until he understood that she could snap the bone if she wanted to, and she was choosing not to, and he went still. The fourth had his hand on his short sword, and she looked at him, just looked, and he did not draw it. 4 men, 5 seconds, and she had not hurt anyone. The square was completely silent, not the angry silence of before. A different silence entirely. The silence of 50 people who have just watched something that has rearranged their assumptions. Abraham stepped forward to stand beside her. He was very aware of his own heartbeat. He held out the 3 pages of the legal brief, folded and tied with cord, and he spoke to Magistrate Fell in a clear voice. Magistrate, I have documentation showing that the writ Lord Harwick issued against the Greyvale settlement, and specifically against Murak Rageborn, was issued under improperly claimed authority, in violation of the existing registered land use agreement between the Valley Council and the Greyvale settlement, and without the council consent required by statute. I request a formal hearing. Fell came down the guild hall steps and held out his hand for the pages. He took them and began reading with the focused, half-squinting attention of a man who is genuinely reading and not performing reading. Harwick said, "This is absurd, Lord Harwick," Fell said, without looking up from the pages. "If you speak again before I have finished reading, I will have you removed from my hearing space, which at present constitutes this entire square." Harwick closed his mouth. The crowd, which had been holding that changed silence, shifted again. Someone in the back laughed, quickly suppressed. A mill worker near the front muttered something to his neighbor. Fell read for 2 full minutes. Then he looked up. "Abraham Talbot," he said, "this is quite thorough." "Thank you, sir. You are the gamekeeper for Lord Harwick's estate." "I am, though I suspect that position may be vacant shortly." Fell looked at Harwick over the pages. "Lord Harwick, the land use agreement you have attempted to void was registered with this council in the 13th year of your father's tenure. The grounds for voiding it, as laid out in council statute, require a formal petition, a hearing, and a majority vote of the council members. None of these steps occurred. Your writ is therefore invalid and is hereby dissolved." Harwick said, "Aye." "Furthermore," Fell continued, in a tone that suggested he had been practicing that word for a long time, "the criminal designation applied to Murak Rageborn is similarly without the legal foundation required by council statute, and is hereby struck. She is not a wanted person in this valley." The square had gone very quiet again, but it was a different quiet now. It was the quiet of a crowd that has switched sides, and Abraham, who had lived in that valley for 8 years, could feel it like a change in air pressure. Harwick looked at his retainers. His retainers looked at the ground. One of them was rubbing his shoulder where it had met the cobblestones. "This will not stand," Harwick said. "It will," Fell said pleasantly. "It is standing right now. Good morning, Lord Harwick." Harwick looked at Abraham with an expression that contained a great deal of information about what the future of Abraham's position on the estate would look like. Abraham looked back at him with the stillness of a man who has made his choices and is comfortable with them. Harwick turned and went, his retainers trailing behind him in varying states of wounded dignity. The crowd watched him go. Then it turned back to the square and back to Murak, and the quality of the attention had changed fundamentally. An older woman near the front, a bread seller Abraham recognized from 3 years of market days, said, "That was fast work for 4 armed men." Murak, who had gone still as stone during the legal proceedings, looked at the woman. "They were not trying hard," she said. The bread seller laughed. Others followed. The laugh moved through the crowd like weather. Abraham exhaled slowly. Vera Ashton appeared at his elbow. "Well done," she said quietly. "Both of you." "Vera, I am likely unemployed as of this afternoon," Abraham said. "The Mill Workers Guild has been looking for an honest man to manage the forest commons for 2 years, Vera said. "The pay is better, and you will not have to write anything with Harwick's name on it." She looked at Murak with the frank, measuring look of a woman who has survived 60 years of a world that does not accommodate women easily. "And we have been looking for a permanent contract with a reliable blade company for the commons boundaries, if the Greyvale band is interested." Murak looked at her for a moment. "That would need to go through the band leadership," she said. "Of course." I imagine you have some influence there. Something passed across Murak's face that might have been amusement. Some. The market day went on around them. Stalls reopened. Conversations resumed. Children who had been held back from the commotion were released into the square. Abraham stood in the morning sun beside Murak and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the specific warmth of a day going right, in public, with someone beside him. He looked at her. She was watching the square with her arms loose at her sides, not on her weapons, for the first time since she had arrived on his ferry bank 3 weeks ago. Watchful still, because that would never entirely leave her, but not braced. Something in the line of her shoulders was different. He said, quietly, "How are you?" She turned to look at him. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me again in an hour." "I will," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she did something he had not seen her do in public before. She put her hand on his arm, not grabbing, not guarding, just resting there, large and warm and deliberate, and she left it there, and she went back to watching the square. He covered her hand with his and left it there too. They ate lunch at the Mill Guild Hall, which Vera Ashton provided in the form of a long table and a great deal of bread and cured meat, and 2 types of river fish. Magistrate Fell joined them and spent 20 minutes explaining, with visible satisfaction, exactly how Harwick's overreach would now need to be formally reviewed by the full council, and what the probable consequences of that review were likely to be. Abraham listened carefully and asked useful questions, and thought that if he ever had reason to retire from gamekeeping entirely, the law had a certain appeal. Murak ate and listened and said very little, but he could see her absorbing everything, filing it away. Afterward, she asked Fell 3 specific questions about the Greyvale land use agreement's permanent status, and his answers were satisfactory enough that she thanked him with the direct, formal courtesy she used when she actually meant it. They crossed back to the South Bank in the late afternoon, alone on the ferry barge. The river was low gold in the evening light, and the valley was going green and long-shadowed, and they worked the rope together without speaking, and it felt familiar now, the motion, the sound of the water, the weight of the barge under their feet. On the north bank she stopped. "I need to go back to Fenhalow," she said, "to tell them the writ is dissolved. The headman and the others, they need to know they are safe." "Of course," he said. "It will take 4 days there and back." She was looking at the road north, then she looked at him. After that, he agreed. She studied him. He was learning to be comfortable in her silences. They were not empty silences, they were full ones. "You gave up your position today," she said. "I gave up Harwick's position," he corrected. "Vera's offer is better." "You gave up your position for me," she said, in the tone of someone who is going to say the true thing regardless of whether it is comfortable. "For the Greyvale settlement," he said, "and for what was right." He paused. "And yes, for you, those things are not mutually exclusive." She was quiet. He said, "Murak, you do not owe me anything for it." "I know," she said. "That is not, it is not debt I am thinking about." She stopped and started again, and it was the first time he had seen her at a loss for the exact word she wanted. "In my experience, when a person does something for you without being asked and without calculating the return, it means either they are foolish or the word in our language is closer to bound. Committed, not contractually." Here, she touched her chest briefly. "I am trying to determine which category applies." He looked at her for a long moment. "And not foolish," she said. He exhaled. "No," he said, "not foolish." She nodded once slowly. Then she shouldered her pack and picked up her bow, and at the gate of the south track she stopped again. She had a way of stopping at gates, and she looked back at him over her shoulder. 4 days, she said. 4 days, he agreed. She went. And this time, unlike the first time, he was not uncertain about what the 4 days would end in. He went back to the cottage and made it ready, and he was not surprised to find that readying it felt like readying himself, and that both felt right. She came back in 3 days. He heard the horse first, not his mare, a different one, a large dun gelding he had not seen before, and he came out of the workshop to find Murak coming up the south track with an ease in her stride that had not been there before. She had been carrying something for a very long time, he realized, and some part of it had been set down. She handed him the horse's lead rope without preamble. "From the headman. He said to tell you that the Greyvale band considers you a man of honor, and the horse is a better thank you than a handshake." Abraham looked at the horse. The horse looked back at him with large, calm eyes. "That is a very good horse," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "His name is apparently Ash." "Hello, Ash," Abraham said. The horse blew out through its nose. Murak watched this exchange with her arms crossed and the expression that he now knew was her version of thoroughly entertained. He put Ash in the stable and they went inside, and she sat at the table and he made food, and they talked about the Fenhalo visit and the headman's relief and the agreement Vera's guild had already sent word about through a valley runner. The Mill Workers Guild offer was real and standing. For Murak, it would mean formalizing the Greyvale band's contract work through a legitimate valley body instead of freelance. For Abraham, it meant Forest Commons management with a salary and no Harwick. "It is a good offer," she said. "It is," he agreed. He sat down across from her. "If you accept it, you would be based in the valley." "Yes," she said. "That would mean you would be here." She looked at him. "Yes." He looked back at her. "I want that," he said simply. "I want you here, Murak, not as a contracted arrangement. Here, this cottage, this valley, with me." She was quiet for a moment. In the silence, the fire moved. "That is a very clear thing to say," she said. "I have been practicing it for 3 days," he said. She looked at him with something that was open and warm and completely unlike the guarded woman who had held an arrow on him at the ferry crossing, and she said, "In the Greyvale tradition, when a warrior claims a home, she brings something to it, something of her own." He waited. "The gelding is my offering," she said. "Not from the headman, from me." She held his gaze. "It means I intend to stay." Something expanded in his chest that took up all the available space. "Then stay," he said. She was around the table and pulling him up from the chair before he had finished the word, and she kissed him the way she did everything with complete commitment and zero performance, and it was deep and warm, and she tasted like river water and wood smoke, and her hands on his face were very careful for someone so strong. He pulled her in and she let him, which was its own kind of gift from a woman who did not let many things. Later, much later, in the deep quiet of the cottage with the fire banked and the stars visible through the south window, he lay with her warmth beside him and thought that this, exactly this, was the thing he had not known he had been building toward. The open-endedness of his 8 years in that valley, the choosing not to leave even when leaving would have been easier, the slow, necessary work of becoming someone who could be here for this. All of it was a kind of preparation he had never named, for exactly this. She was not asleep. He could tell by the quality of her stillness, which was different from sleep. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The ferry," she said. "Which time?" "The first time, 7 years ago." A pause. "You were so angry. You walked back from the estate house with that document in your fist, and you read it out loud without any performance, just the facts in that voice, and I remember thinking that you were the most peculiar human I had ever seen." "Peculiar," he repeated. "In the best way," she said. "In the way of something that does not fit the category you expect. Most human men who did something brave in front of orcs did it with a great deal of look at me about it. You just did the thing. And then you went back to work." "I was 24, he said. "I was mostly just furious." "I know," she said. "That is what made it real." She was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to speak to you before we left. I did not." "Why?" She considered this. "Because I was 22 and I had no idea what I would say, and it seemed better to carry it than to make it awkward and strange. A beat. I was wrong." 7 years ago, he said. 7 years, she agreed. He turned to look at her profile in the dark. "We have time now," he said. She turned to look back at him. Her yellow eyes caught the faint light from the window. "Yes," she said. "We do." He settled back. She settled. The cottage held them both. The weeks that followed had a quality he could only describe as abundance. Not the abundance of things, but of days of waking with purpose, and going to sleep with the specific contentment of hours that had been used well. He took up the Forest Commons position with the Mill Workers' Guild, which meant his work was now in service of the valley itself rather than a single lord's interests, and it suited him in a way that Harwick's gamekeeping never quite had. He was mapping the commons boundaries in detail, identifying the old growth areas, documenting the water sources and the game populations with the same careful thoroughness he had always applied to Pell's lessons. Murak negotiated the Greyvale contract with Vera Ashton over 4 days of back and forth that apparently involved Vera learning a great deal of respect for the precise, rigorous way an orc warrior approached a contract-specific language. The agreement was signed and witnessed by Magistrate Fell and registered with the council, and it meant that the Greyvale band had a legitimate, documented role in the valley's security and commons management, not as outsiders tolerated at the margin, but as contracted participants with council recognition. Harwick, for his part, did not go quietly. He could not legally challenge the magistrate's ruling, but he was not above leveraging what social power he still held to make things difficult. He spoke publicly against the Greyvale contract at the first council session after it was filed. He paid for riders to carry letters to the larger town of Brackford, 30 miles east, whose council had some regional authority, trying to get the Valley Council's decision reviewed. The Brackford Council declined. They had their own complicated history with Harwick the Younger, who had overextended his family's influence into Brackford markets 3 years prior, and they were not inclined to do him favors. But Harwick's maneuvering meant that Murak and Abraham moved through the valley under ongoing scrutiny in those early months. Not danger, Fell's ruling was clear, and Vera's guild was a powerful backer, but scrutiny. Eyes in the market. Conversations that stopped when they entered a tavern. The specific, exhausting experience of people waiting to see if this was going to be a real thing or whether it would dissolve under pressure. It did not dissolve. They were both people who understood pressure. One afternoon in early summer, Abraham was at the Greyvale market, the same square where the confrontation with Harwick's men had happened, picking up supplies and talking with the blacksmith about some tools he needed for the commons work. Murak was beside him, not in her usual ready state but relaxed, with her bow over her shoulder and her arms easy, watching the square with the casual attention of someone who has decided a space is safe and is simply observing. A group of young men came around the corner from the mill road, 3 of them, with the quality of people who have been discussing something and have worked themselves up about it. They stopped when they saw Murak and began saying things, not quiet enough to be uncertain, not the kinds of things that would bear repeating at length. Abraham turned. He did not say anything dramatic. He looked at the 3 young men with the specific, steady look of a man who is not afraid and is not performing being unafraid, and he said, "You can move on or you can make this a formal matter with the guild. Those are your options this morning." The blacksmith, who was a large man and had heard everything, put down the tool he was holding and turned to look at the young men too. The 3 young men moved on. Murak watched them go. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You did not need to do that." "No," he agreed. "I wanted to." She looked at him with that open expression that still, months in, hit him with the force of something unexpected. "Abraham," she said. "Murak," he said. The blacksmith picked up his tool again. "So," the blacksmith said in the tone of a man returning to business, "these compass fittings you need. What specifications exactly?" And that was also part of it, the way the ordinary moments of the valley slowly began to include them. It was not a sudden change. It did not happen because Harwick's men were rooted in the square or because Fell dissolved the writ. It happened the way acceptance usually does, in the slow, ordinary accumulation of days. The bread seller who had laughed on market day became someone who greeted Murak by name. The ferryman who had nervously overheard everything became, somewhat to his own embarrassment, a reliable person to nod to. The mill workers whose guild employed Abraham began to know Murak as the contract negotiator from the Greyvale band, who had a terrifyingly sharp eye for contract language, and once helped pull a cartwheel out of the mud on the East Commons Road without being asked. Lord Harwick the younger removed himself from Greyvale by early autumn, retreating to the family's main estate in Brackford with what dignity he could manage. The Greyvale estate was put under a caretaker, which suited Abraham perfectly, as it meant no one was actively managing the forest against him. He continued to respect the boundaries as he always had, because that was who he was regardless of who owned what. The cottage on the South Ridge was, by then, fully both of theirs. Not formally, they had not performed any ceremony, orc or human, but in every practical sense. Ash the gelding shared the stable with Abraham's mare, and they had reached an accommodation. The storage room was no longer a storage room but a proper room with a bed built to a size that accommodated someone of Murak's height, and a weapons rack on the wall that she maintained with the same meditative precision she always had. He had asked her once, in the late summer, about that precision with her weapons. She had said, "A warrior who does not care for her weapons is a warrior who does not care for herself. The weapons are an extension of what I am. If I neglect them, I neglect that." He had thought about that for a long time after. One evening in mid-autumn, when the leaves on the oaks were going amber and the river in the valley below ran high and cold, he came back from the commons work to find her sitting outside on the stone bench. She had her short blade across her knees and she was not cleaning it. She was just looking out at the valley. He sat beside her. He did not say anything. He waited. After a while she said, "One of the Greyvale band is leaving, going west across the mountains. His name is Doran. He has been with us for 12 years. A pause. He said the valley is too settled for him now, too many names for everything." Abraham understood that this was not simply about Doran. "Do you feel that?" He asked. "Too settled." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "No, I feel like I spent a very long time moving because standing still was dangerous, and now I am standing still and it is not dangerous, and I do not entirely know what to do with that." "You have been doing quite well at it," he said. "Have I?" "From where I am sitting," he said, "you have been extraordinary at it." She turned to look at him. The amber light was on her face, and her green skin held it in that way. It always did, and he thought, as he always did, that she was the most striking person he had ever known, not in spite of what she was, but entirely and specifically because of it. "Abraham," she said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "In the Greyvale tradition," she said carefully, "there is a marking. When a warrior commits to a bond, not a contract, not an arrangement, a bond, she marks it on her skin. Here." She touched the inside of her left wrist. There was already ink there. He knew old marks from the band in the angular Greyvale script. "It is her choice alone. No ceremony. No witness required. It is simply the record of a truth she has decided." He looked at her wrist. "Have you made a mark like that before?" "No," she said. He held her gaze. "I want to," she said. "For this, for you." She paused. "But in the human tradition, I believe there is usually an exchange, a spoken thing, a question." Her yellow eyes were steady and clear and more open than he had ever seen them. "I do not know your words for it. I know what I am trying to say." Abraham Talbot, who had spent 8 years alone in that valley and 31 years being an ordinary, unremarkable man who read a great deal, and walked the forest and fixed things that were broken, and occasionally said the true thing when other people did not, Abraham Talbot looked at the woman beside him and felt every one of those years arrange themselves into something that made sense. He took her hand. Her left hand, with the old marks on the inside of her wrist. "Murak Rageborn," he said, "I am asking you to stay, not as a contracted arrangement, and not because the valley is settled now, and not because the cottage is large enough for both of us. Because I have been alone in a specific way that I did not fully understand was specific until you were here, and because I watched you hold 4 armed men still with your bare hands, and then listen to a magistrate read legal statutes with the same quality of complete attention, and because you split my firewood without being asked, and remembered me from 7 years ago, and chose to come back through this crossing when you could have chosen any other route in the valley." He paused. "And because when you kissed me the first time, it felt like something I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting." She was very still. "I am asking," he said, "because the question in my tradition is a question. I am not assuming." She looked at him for what might have been 30 seconds or might have been much longer, with those clear yellow eyes that held everything she had ever survived and everything she had ever decided and everything she was still deciding. Then she said, "Yes." Simple, complete, entirely her. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist, over the old marks, and she made a small sound that was nothing like her public self, and everything like who she was when she was not guarding anything. The marking she made the following day, with ink and a fine-tipped tool she had carried for years in one of the bandolier pouches, was 3 angular characters in the Greyvale script on the inside of her left wrist, below the old marks. He asked her what they meant. She said, something close to chosen and choosing again. He thought that was the most complete thing he had ever heard. He could not make the same mark on himself. He did not carry that tradition, and he would not perform it inauthentically. But he had, over the summer, been learning to carve from the blacksmith's wife, who was a patient teacher, and he made her a small thing from oak, a disc no bigger than his palm, with the angular characters she had shown him pressed into the surface, threaded on a cord. He gave it to her without ceremony. She held it in her hand for a long time. Then she put it around her neck. She wore it every day after that, and he saw her touch it sometimes, at the ferry crossing, at the market, during difficult contract negotiations, in the unconscious way of someone reaching for a known weight. Autumn went to winter, and winter was hard in the valley the way it always was. The river ran high and there were 3 floods that required the common's boundary markers to be reset, and the eastern mill road washed out, and Abraham spent 2 weeks organizing the repair work with the mill workers in cold that cracked his lips and numbed his fingers even in good gloves. Murak worked the Greyvale contract's winter provisions. There were 3 boundary incidents along the common's edges where neighboring estates sent workers across without authorization, and she resolved them all without violence, but with the specific quality of clarity that made it plain that the next incident would go differently. The complaints stopped. They came home to each other at the ends of those days, and the cottage was warm and the fire was good and she was there, and he thought, with the simple certainty of a man who has lived long enough to know the difference, this is the thing I was looking for, not a shape I had preconceived, the actual thing. The valley's first real acceptance of them as simply themselves, not a subject, not a debate, not a thing to have a position on, came at the spring market, the full year after the confrontation in the square. It was market day again, and the square was busy, and Abraham and Murak came around the corner from the river road the same way they always did, and the market continued without a notable pause. Not silence, not held breath, not the quality of people waiting to decide. Just the market continuing with them in it. The bread seller called out to Murak about the basket she had repaired for her in January in exchange for a loaf of that specific seeded bread Murak had become partial to, and Murak confirmed she had it and produced it from her pack. A mill worker clapped Abraham on the shoulder in passing and said something about the East Road repair that needed answering before the next rain. 2 of the Greyvale band members who were in town on contract business came across the square and spoke with Murak in their language for a few minutes, and Abraham stood nearby and watched the square and did not try to follow the conversation. And when it was done, Murak came back to him and translated the essential points, new contract boundary questions, a request from the headman in her precise, thorough way. And Magistrate Fell, who was buying a book from the traveling bookseller's cart in the corner of the square, caught Abraham's eye across the crowd and nodded, once, in the satisfied manner of a man who has made a good ruling and watched it bear out over time. Abraham nodded back. Murak was beside him and her hand found his in the ordinary way it did now, not a statement, just a habit, just the body doing what it did when the person it wanted was close enough. He folded his fingers around hers, large green hand and weather-worn human one, in the middle of the Greyvale market square in the spring light. She said quietly, "How is it?" He looked around at the square, at Vera Ashton arguing pleasantly with a cloth merchant, at the children playing around the granary steps, where Harwick had stood and tried to issue commands that did not hold, at the river glinting at the end of the market street and the ferry tied up at the near bank, and the willows along the water going new green in the spring. "Good," he said. "It is good." She leaned against him slightly. She was taller than him by nearly a head, and the lean was a deliberate choice, a thing she did when the public space felt safe enough for it and looked at the same square. "Yes," she said, "it is." They stood like that for a moment, in the center of the valley that had tried to push her out and failed, and that had tried to keep him in its margins and largely succeeded, until she came through on the ferry and rearranged the whole equation. They stood in it like they belonged there, which was not something either of them had felt easily or early in life, and which was, by any measure that mattered, true. Later they crossed the river on the ferry. She worked the rope, because she liked to. She had from the beginning, he thought, though she had never said so. There was something about the pull and the movement and the water that suited her. He stood at the prow and watched the near bank approach, and thought about arrows hitting ferry posts and yellow eyes deciding whether to fire again. When the barge bumped the near bank, she tied it off in exactly the way he had shown her, which was the particular knot Pell had taught him, and she had learned it from watching him and done it correctly the first time she tried. He stood on the bank and watched her finish the knot, and she stood and looked at him, and he said, because he was thinking it, "I love you." He had said it before, a handful of times, in the deliberate, quiet way he had, and each time she had looked at him with that particular expression that was raw and open and absolutely real. She looked at him that way now. "Abraham," she said. She said his name like it was the most specific word she knew. Then she stepped off the barge and wrapped one large arm around him and pulled him against her and pressed her mouth to his hair, and he felt her exhale slow and complete, like a person who has been holding something in for a long time and has finally found the place where they do not have to anymore. She did not say the words in common tongue. She said 3 words in the Greyvale language, quietly against his hair, and he did not know the specific words, but he knew their meaning exactly, the way he knew from 3 characters inscribed on his wrist that she had been since that ferry crossing a year ago, had perhaps been for 7 years before that, chosen and choosing again. He stood in her arm on the near bank of the Greyvale crossing, with the spring river running past and the willows moving in the light wind and the valley green and real around them, and he thought, Here is the place. Here is exactly where I am meant to be, and exactly who I am meant to be here with, and that is the whole of it, and the whole of it is more than enough." On the wall of the gamekeeper's cottage, inside the door, Abraham had hung a single piece of equipment he had carried with him from the first day of his work, a tracker's compass, old and battered, with a cracked face that still read true. Pell had given it to him. He had carried it in his coat pocket for 8 years. On the morning after Murak made her marking, he had moved it from his pocket to the wall. He did not need it in his pocket anymore. He knew where he was. The compass hung inside the door of the cottage that was theirs, and sometimes when he came in from the common's work he touched it briefly, the way she touched the carved oak disc, and felt the same thing she felt, a known weight, a certain thing in an uncertain world. Proof that you can spend a very long time looking for the place where you belong, and then find it suddenly, in the form of a woman on the opposite bank with an arrow drawn and yellow eyes deciding. And the deciding, it turned out, had gone both ways from the beginning. It had gone both ways from the very beginning. Outside, the Greyvale River ran, the ferry waited on its rope, and the oaks on the south ridge were in full spring leaf. And in the cottage's yard the 2 horses moved in the stable, the old mare and Ash the dun gelding, brought as an offering and accepted as what it was, and the firewood was split in neat rows against the wall, and the south track ran clear and open through the forest that Abraham Talbot knew by heart, that Murak Rageborn had crossed twice and would cross every day from now on without question. The weapons were hung on the rack inside the storage room, clean, ready, not needed today. This was the home she had put them down in. This was the man she had looked at before she did. This was the valley and the crossing and the morning, ordinary and extraordinary at once, the way the best things always are, and it was theirs, and it held.